how will the developing alliance between Russia, China, Iran, and to some extent North Korea change under a Trump administration?
I mean, this is the most dynamic field because, we call it an alliance. It's not really an alliance. There's very few formal agreements. It's much more of a network, of mutual interests. And those mutual interests, when we dig into them, Filter Labs data, the social media data, it's very clear that the only thing that really unites them is resentment of America. There's actually a huge amount of mistrust, a huge amount of tension, a huge amount of fears. They can all unite when they say, well, we do have one thing in common. We all hate America. So I wonder what Trump will do with that. Will Trump actually try to break that? He's sort of intimated several times that he doesn't think China has to be an enemy. He doesn't actually always sound like a China hawk. He's talking about, walking back the TikTok ban. Maybe we could see a change in those dynamics where China and America actually do weirdly grow towards each other despite these threats of tariffs. And then China no longer sees any particular reason to hang out with those losers in Moscow and Tehran.
Welcome back to Navigating Noise. Today, we're going to do something special. I've been really thrilled and kind of a little stunned about the response that we've gotten. And so people have been messaging and asking questions who we've run into about it, who said we saw some clip or something, or and even people say, I listened to the whole thing. And I had some questions for you. And so we've kind of collated some of those questions, and we're going to just run through here, joined today with Peter Pomerantsev. As many of you know him, he's been an occasional co-host with me on the podcast. Peter, the author of How to Win an Information War, which we're going to ask him about how we're going to do that at some point here, because that's what some people are wanting to know about political warfare. But thanks, Peter, for joining me on this. So I have a set of questions here. I'm going to run through them, but let's start out with the first most obvious one here, and I'm going to have you answer this one, Peter. And this is just really vague in general, how will the rest of the world react to Trump?
Well, the rest of the world obviously isn't one place, but I think everybody is the same with Trump. The magic of Trump, his superpower, is that he says so many contradictory and crazy things that anybody can hallucinate what they want into him. So you have this miracle of, I use that in slightly ironically, of both sort of people who want to annex the West Bank to Israel, and Muslims who support the Palestinian cause in Dearborn, both voting for him, because he just, he says so many different things that you can see what you want into it. And even though everyone kind of admits that he's a bit wacky, they all think, well, in that wackiness, I might be able to achieve my end. In that turbulence and disruption, I'll get my thing. And I think it's the same across the world. Everyone's going, well, it's dangerous. He might come after us, but in the chaos, I might get my thing. And I think that's deeply seductive. And I think invariably a lot of people are going to be left very disappointed. It's probably people who bought into sort of, Trump wine and Trump steaks and Trump University thought as well.
Yeah. I mean, one thing that I was struck by in some of our analysis of particularly China and Iran on the election is that both countries were particularly confident that they knew how to play this in their advantage. And it seems like everyone is. And you're probably right that they're going to be as disappointed as the degree holders from Trump University are. Okay, next question. Relatedly, and again, Peter, this is your thing here. What happens with Ukraine after Trump takes power? We've obviously had a lot of conversation around and the what JD Vance's comments about Ukraine. Trump himself claimed at one point he was going to end it in one day. It sounds like the latest update that is 6 months on it. But what do you think is the most likely, considering that U.S. support will draw back to it. How does this play out for Ukraine over the next 6 to 12 months?
Well, a lot of people speculate that Trump has kind of like some delusions that he's godlike in some ways, and certainly his treatment of the idea of day is a lot like Genesis. And like, on day one, he created the world. On day two, he created the earth. And most interpretations of Genesis see that as a metaphor, and Trump would probably say, "Hey, I meant day one as a metaphor for stuff." So, listen. Trump is, of course, very powerful, and America is very powerful. But the problem with the Ukrainian situation is that there are other players that Trump cannot control, and most notably Russia and its increasing benefactor, China. And they will set the agenda. They will decide when they want to pause. And Trump's, if he's going to be doing anything serious, has to work out what means he has to slow their march. Because to get to the negotiating table, they have to agree to it. I think there's a delusion and a huge confusion in Western discourse about when will Ukraine negotiate. Ukraine's always been ready to talk about negotiating. Russia has shown no interest, absolutely no interest, because their intent is to destroy Ukraine until their means run out. So this is not something that Trump actually can particularly control. He can say he's cutting off all weapons to Ukraine, cause a rupture with Europe. The Ukrainians will keep on battling because they also have agency. So there is a limitation to his agency. That doesn't mean he's not influential. He can cause huge harm and some decency. But again, there are limits to the omnipotency of this particular pseudo divine.
Yeah, that strikes me as right. It also strikes me as a more general point about the U.S. presidency, in that it's outside of the U.S. It does encounter a lot of other kind of counterweights to it.
Well, even inside the US, it's
yeah.
thankfully quite limited compared to other systems. So what's left if you can't define the global stuff? If you can't actually find a cure for homelessness, which I wish somebody could, but I don't think the president probably can, then what's left is inventing enemies and going after them. So I think we'll see a lot of that.
Yeah. Well, that's a good segue to one of the other questions is in this, like, who defines what is a friend and an enemy here, on that. I have some thoughts, but you go first.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting one because obviously we have like our old ideas of international alliances and NATO and all that. And I'm not saying they've disappeared, but I think they've lost that animating and emotional power. I mean, they're kind of like the friends that your parents arrange and they come to your party and everyone's sitting there going, why did mommy and daddy set me up with this? I don't understand. I can't really remember this weird Cold War marriage that was forced onto us. But I think even the most isolationist sort of Vancian knows that you need friends. Yeah. But you can't actually just sort of like segregate yourself from the rest of the world. So what is it? What do you need them for? And I think if you listen to the debates, I think it's summed up in this idea of supply chains. It's supply chain security, whether that's raw materials or whether that's microchips, or I think there's this sudden realization that globalization has left us in a position where China dominates the batteries for our electric vehicles, or many, many, many other things. And friends are going to be the people who you trust enough to secure your supply chains with. And that's going to be the new networks that bind. And I would like to think they'll be correlated with some political values as well, but we'll see.
So I was like going to take this in a completely different direction and be like so much more philosophical about this and critical about America, and that like using like Aristotle's 3 forms of friendship to say friendships of pleasure, friendships of utility, and like virtuous friendships. And so basically, friendships of pleasure are those friends you just love hanging out with. You get pleasure from them. Friendships of utility, they do something for you. That's why you're friends. They're like business partners, and you might use the and friendships of virtue and Aristotle were those that like make you better person. And I like think about like American and English, we don't have all these like different senses, and that Americans think somehow that like all of their friends are that higher category, and they're always disappointed to learn that there's all these like different levels of it. And I think the same is like true for enemy. And we have like these very we're either all friends or we're all like enemies on it, and that like I think we'll like see more that's like it's just gonna be so much more transactional. And like those friends who like we had like told big stories about, I think we're gonna see even those become even more transactional. Because I think like the one way that people have successfully like engaged with Trump is not to like take him super seriously or as a joke, but to like deal with him in that very transactional way and to engage on that there and to see some people who we've like talked about through this rhetoric of friendship and these like long stories about how we're better together, we're stronger together. And it's, I think it will be much more transactional on it. So it's basically the same way to say it, but like less um, eloquent or even accessible to most people. But I'm an academic by background, so that's what I get to do. And so the next question here, what should we do here? Oh, something else. So there's a lot on Trump here, unsurprisingly, because this, kind of we launched the podcast during, when the campaign was kicking off, and that was on everyone's mind and probably came up in every episode. Was okay. Another thing Trump can't really do much about there. But how will the developing alliance between Russia, China, Iran, and to some extent North Korea change under a Trump administration? There, those are, yeah. Peter, what would you say?
I mean, this is the most dynamic field, because we call it an alliance. It's not really an alliance. There's very few formal agreements. Sometimes people use the word axis, but only because of like a David Frum speech from like whatever years ago, the axis of evil. It's much more of a network, of mutual interests. And there's mutual interests when we dig into them with the Filter Labs data, the sort of the social media data. It's very clear that the only thing that really unites them is resentment of America. There's actually a huge amount of mistrust, a huge amount of tension, a huge amount of fears. But they can all unite when they say, well, we do have one thing in common: we all hate America. So, so I wonder what Trump will do with that. Will Trump actually try to break that? He's sort of intimated several times that he doesn't think China has to be an enemy. He doesn't actually always sound like a China hawk. He's talking about, walking back the TikTok ban. He has people around him who are very keen to ingratiate themselves further with China. He seems much less actually of a kind of like sturdy China hawk than Biden was. So maybe we could see a changing in those dynamics where China and America actually do weirdly grow towards each other despite these threats of tariffs. And then China no longer sees any particular reason to hang out with those losers in Moscow and Tehran. So we could be in for a very, very dynamic time. Could go the absolute opposite direction. Trump gets really, really nasty with both Europe and China. And Europe goes, you know what? It's better for us to start balancing between the US and China, and starts cozying up to China a lot.
Yeah, so I suspect nothing will change here on it. And part of that has to do with just like planning horizon, if we want to use that very like bureaucratic term. There is that like we like in America, we think in these like 4-year increments often. And that's, sometimes even 1-year increments. And that's one of like the deep crises about our national security is that like we fund, at least intelligence, only 1 year at a time. And we don't really think about long-term priorities. We think about them, but we don't actually plan around them as much as we should. And there's like China definitely is thinking in much longer horizons. And when China says soon, they usually mean not quite the same as we mean soon. They mean like within the next 20 to 30, sometimes 40 years, something will happen there. And such that like what they've put in motion will probably not, they won't change it within such a short period of time unless some real external shock event occurs to that alliance there. And that's I don't know what that would look like if it weren't some kind of more, aggressive thing from outside the alliance, and that seems unlikely at this point. So I think what we'll probably see is, growing attachment to each other on a lot of things. I do think that the decoupling of Russia and Europe economy is something that's going to be hard to reverse course on and such. And that does seem to be one of the backbones of it. But like you said, what unites them like effectively, why are they emotionally involved in this bond? It does seem to have a lot to do with just anti-Americanism from what we've seen in the data there. Okay, let's go on to, will Trump lean into economic warfare? And will he try to weaponize supply chains? I guess my short answer to that is no. I don't think he will. I don't think he's going to do it. I think he's going to do it very selectively. I don't think because there's a lot of complexity to it, and it doesn't seem that they have really set up to try to change the complexity, change the system so much around it. But what's your thought, Peter?
I think, again, these are things that he should do if he wants to be a popular, effective president that becomes so popular he can break the Constitution and stay out of prison for 4 more years. So I'm doing a lot of research about what Americans want. And Americans actually do, especially MAGA Americans, they really do want to project power, but they want to do it in what they call smart ways. So cyber attacks. Why aren't we doing our own cyber attacks, they say? What are our James Bonds up to? Why can't we, have these really cool economic warfare teams that break down the military supply chains feeding Hamas in Iran? What's going on? They want these kind of new forms of James Bond meets FBI meets Tobey Maguire type power, and Trump might understand that. He did his Space Force thing because he realized people like space, so let's do a Space Force thing. So, the great something that Trump understands is that Americans feel, or his voters feel, so disempowered by the last 20 years of foreign policy losses and domestic economic disasters that they want some way to feel strong, some way to make themselves feel effective again. Which is why he's doing this whole saber rattling, or it's not saber rattling, sort of pretend lightsaber rattling like a little kid against Canada and Greenland. Because his audience are like, oh look, they're all scared of us. It's great. Ha ha ha. How funny. But you can do that a little bit to your allies, but I'm assuming, maybe wrongly, it's not gonna go that far. But at some point you want some real results. Whenever we ask Americans in the research, when is the moment that you felt most proud to be American? Everybody says the killing of bin Laden. Yeah? They love that. They love our special ops went in, whacked the guy. It was clean, no boots on the ground apart from the experts, all that kind of stuff. So if you can take that into the economic world, if you can show what economic warfare can do, if you can pull off what the Israelis pulled off with blowing up a bunch of Hezbollah pagers, all that kind of stuff, or I don't know, so the North Koreans wake up tomorrow and, all their, probably quite technologically quite safe, but, none of their GPS is working and all their cars had to sort of stop on the freeway. And we did that. I think Trump would realize that Americans like that.
Well, I think what you're saying right there, that's just like hybrid warfare sort of activity. It's like economic warfare. I guess what thing about that is usually trade. They're kind of setting in new regulations such that um, you could only use American certain products in an airplane, for example, because it's a national security risk, or they might turn it into a safety risk, all of that. And I think we sometimes can be led astray a little bit by the analogy of warfare on it there, because it's not that type of thing. When you get into like hybrid warfare on it, yeah, you're gonna see that there. I guess the question I have is whether Trump is going to try to weaponize American corporations to some extent, in the same sense. Like, and weaponize there is not like try to turn them much more into a strong arm of American interest and power. There, I think there's been a lot of in the MAGA world, frustration as to like these corporations are American, but they don't actually do anything for us. And looking at other stronger state systems that they have corporations that do kind of leverage their corporate sector on it. Next question. I guess this was something you just pointed to. There's something that perhaps Trump supporters would like is, what are the real prospects of cyber conflict? And this is what will it actually look like in the world there?
So this is a funny one. So when we poll Americans and we sort of highlight stories that people would be aware of if they read Wired magazine really carefully, or if they followed the Microsoft threat reports, we pointed out to Americans in sort of message testing exercises about, how do you feel about the fact that Russians and Iranians have been hacking American water systems and American electricity utilities and disable the largest pipeline in America. And people have not heard about these stories, and when they hear about them, they're kind of shocked. And it's one of the kind of strongest motivators for audiences to say we need to do something about this. So all he needs to do is just say out loud what previous administrations only whisper about because they don't want to spread alarm. But if Trump wants to raise alarm, then he could do that very, very easy. And of course, there's a big taboo about what we do back. But I guess Trump's all about breaking taboos. I mean, there's many rumors around Washington about various retaliations the Americans may have done towards the Russians in the last 4 years, including quite spectacular ones. I have no idea if they're true. This might be rumors about lights going off in Russian cities. I have no idea if it's true, but they're pretty persistent. And the taboo is, of course, that the legality around these actions is very, very opaque. But we have a president who doesn't really care about legality or taboos. At any rate, again, it's a really easy one for him to start elevating.
Yeah, I do think that probably is one of those where it probably does almost like meet the moment for him on this, is that the upsides are too big and the downsides are too small for him not to accelerate.
Well, you've got to do something back. You've got to do something. If you go, look, Russia and China have been hacking our hospitals, which they have been. Or Russian Iranian proxies have been hacking our hospitals. Then if you say that, if you say like they took down, which they did, the largest hospital in LA, the internet system, not the IC machines, just but it's still like going after a huge hospital is pretty fucked up. You've got to do something back. So I mean that's why this subject has always been taboo. It's like do we get into these kind of tit for tat actions?
Well, I think they're taboo because of another question here is the relation to political warfare more generally. In that, I think particularly under the Biden administration, we saw great hesitancy to use not only things like cyber on one hand, but also to wage more like informational operations on it and to kind of promote those and kind of actually resource them and improve them in a way it's kind of widely discussed in conversations I've had with officials at the Pentagon is that it's kind of seen as a lower performing element among the U.S. arsenal here, just suggest, which I guess suggests to me that we just haven't really like committed to it some way. Do you think if you kind of look at the broader category of political warfare that, and this is something that people have posed to us, like, will that accelerate under Trump on it? Will like basically the gloves come off and there'll just be more openness to doing, because again, he might make the same calculus. They're like, hey, we're not going to be sacked. We're not going to have to put any like boots on the ground anywhere, but we can still, like play the other game.
It would be weird if it not. I mean, he's surrounded by people who are really good at the dark arts of propaganda. And maybe the best use for them would be to go and take on China and Russia and Iran. We have this guy in Britain called Dominic Cummings who came up with Brexit and then won the election for Boris Johnson. And he's largely a destructive force in politics. But I've always gone like, can we not just take his very, very destructive talents and launch them at some other enemies apart from democracy? So, I mean, these guys are all propaganda. They totally understand, unlike Sullivan, the power of information over reality. In terms of their policy making, they go story first, policy second. They come up with a story and drag a policy into it. They don't come up with a policy and do some public affairs around it. So they're completely narrative driven. They understand that narratives are kind of more powerful than they ever have been in the world. And in terms of global conflict, they really don't want to put boots on the ground. They're very squeamish. But they definitely want to scrap. I mean, they're actually not classic isolationists, or most of them aren't. They're primicists or whatever fuzzy term think tankers have come up with recently. But they definitely want to show that we are winning. And let's say they have this very sort of dark vision about supply chains and natural resources. There's a crazy battle going on in sub-Saharan Africa, where a mix of Chinese corruption, Russian mercenaries, and Russian propaganda have kind of secured vast zones of natural resources, which will then be used for Chinese goods and get dumped on the European markets and destroy American businesses. It starts in Africa, it ends in American jobs. And there's a very strong, cynical argument to make that you should be striking back with a similar tool set. If we're clever about this, we'll do this in a way that is in partnership with partners, so to speak. I mean, is that we're not just going to act as kind of like a new scramble for Africa and disgusting imperialists, but actually do something that's in partnership with local democratic forces. But I mean, you would hope that the one thing that these guys would be good at is going to be sort of international propaganda campaigns.
Well, I think to some extent, this is like one of those places where like the Trump administration could accelerate things in a way that's productive there, particularly if they do, like you said, like take these skills that they've honed in one way and turn them to actually some other uses there on it.
Well, it could be very destructive as well. I mean, there's a way of thinking about propaganda. It's not that it's good or bad. It's what the aims are. So we'll see what, if they decide to help Russia or help China with their propaganda and destroy, I don't know, Western Europe and destroy the EU, which is kind of what they seem to be doing on their weekends at the moment, as a kind of fun. Then it could be very, very, it all depends what they target it at. If they target it at sort of, expansionist dictatorships, then maybe that's the best use of their time.
Yeah. I mean, I think they could change things altogether and just how this sits within like the Defense Department there on it, and things like that could be good. like the info operations under like J39 structure in the combatant commands, that that doesn't always, just how they kind of resource it and how it interacts with a lot of things, doesn't always get us the best results on things. And so like at this point, there's almost like no reason to do it at times because we're not good at it.
I mean, look, this is an age-old problem in democracies. In my last book, I looked at World War II and how the political warfare division was kind of fought over by special ops, by the Ministry of Information, by pretty much every department in government tried to own it. And in the end, Churchill got so fed up, he was like, it's going to be its own thing, and created something called the Political Warfare Executive, which was not a million miles away from the US Information Agency in the Cold War, though it was sort of the US Information Agency plus CIA info ops in one. The history is that if you want that stuff to work well, you've got to empower it so it's not eaten up by another department who thinks in a way that's not necessarily very amenable.
Okay, two more questions here. How will foreign powers take advantage of our social media relaxations on this?
Relaxation.
This is definitely in the news right now with as we're recording this, Mark Zuckerberg just I guess in the last 24 hours announced that he was going to get rid of content moderation there and go back to the core of what Facebook does best, is empower free speech on it. That I actually, I think this one's really, really hard to answer because we don't actually have as much evidence as sometimes we pretend we do on what the overall effect was from foreign intervention within social media itself. There that we've like often have them. We probably have, I think if anyone logs on to a lot of these platforms, they see just as much corporate content, and often individual users are now basically accounts shilling for some corporate account there, and such that it is actually overwhelmed at this point by kind of marketing material at this point. And I think people are actually searching for more niche environments, and this has happened pretty consistently, kind of steadily rather, over the last several years. And you saw this kind of beginning in non-Western places where their social media environments were pretty terrible for various reasons, and they started going to messenger apps as the dominant place where they kind of engaged in that typical discourse of social media. And I think you saw some of Russia responding to this through like the use of doppelganger sites, and putting that together alongside of their social media campaigns. So I guess maybe it's just a classic academic answer is like, I don't know on it, or it's hard to say right now. But I think that as social media has become less important and to some extent, or rather the place where fewer and fewer conversations are like really happening at this point, it kind of wonders whether the relaxation of that is just attempting to find another way to generate more users on it and more activity on their platforms in general. But I don't know. What would you say, Peter?
Look, Musk talks incessantly how he is for free speech. Zuckerberg today said that he wants to go back to his free speech principles. Free speech is not just the right to say whatever you want, it's also the right to receive information. We always forget about it. It's got two bits to it. And they're there in American law and the UN declarations and EU law. Nobody argues with this. And when it comes to social media, we actually don't understand anything behind what happens behind the curtain. Yeah. We don't understand what's going on in the platforms. We don't understand if Musk is purposefully doing something on X that boosted Hamas content wildly after October the 7th. Yeah, is he a Hamas sympathizer? Probably not. I don't think he is. But it went up a lot. Was he doing something for that to happen? We don't. Musk is very, very concerned about sort of like grooming gangs. I'm also very, very concerned about grooming gangs. One of the huge issues in the world is his platform doing things to minimize sexual victimization and exploitation. Yeah. We don't know. The only way forward, if these guys say that they believe in freedom of speech, which I don't actually think they do, because if they did, they would open up their platforms like a modern chef opens up his kitchen. Yeah. And we would be able to see that. And we'd be able to know, has Musk spent the last month downgrading Steve Bannon and his acolytes because they were giving him a hard time or not? And he'd be able to have a transparent relationship with the mobs that he claims to be leading. And we will be able to understand, why do we see one thing and not another? Is it because of a Russian campaign? Is it because of a Zuckerberg tweak? Or is it because actually we're all assholes and we want to see horrible racist stuff on Instagram all the time? We don't know. And because we don't know, we don't have any kind of public sphere in any serious sense. So I would just like these guys to be good to their word. They claim they're for freedom of speech. I'm for freedom of speech. Let's have proper freedom of speech. Because what we have at the moment is something else. It's something actually closer to the Russian and Chinese system, in the sense that you've got a couple of people controlling everything about how we, not just what information, disinformation we see, but our whole kind of interaction with the world. Yeah. And they control it based on their personal psychological kinks, in Musk's case, or in terms of what generates a revenue model that we don't really understand with Zuckerberg. But we have no idea how it works. I mean, this is how the Russian internet works, where like you have no idea when you're on the Russian internet what's real, what's a bot, what's a troll, what piece of news has been boosted by the Kremlin, where's the genuine one. You have no idea. You have no idea how your own data is being used. It's kind of where we are when it comes to the governance of social media.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add to that would be, or I guess is maybe just be to double click on one thing, is that like they sometimes, what they know about what's going on their platform on the back end is hard to discover in a lot of ways there, and it's hard to make it transparent in a lot of ways. And there are some things that I think anyone in the industry would also kind of recognize, is the way that we still utilize a lot of manual work. And those are kind of secrets that we don't really want to get out so much, because we have told stories about how we're automating all these things and turning it into something that, you know, has really high margins on it. But in getting there, we're going to have to use a lot of manual work. That, coupled with the automation that they have implemented and how they would actually kind of understand it from the inside, creates this place where they're just they're going to be very reticent ever to like really clarify what's going on in the back end. Maybe because it's hard to do that when you've actually properly implemented some form of machine learning methodology. Or on the other hand, they want to kind of keep the secret under wraps that they're still using a lot of manual work. And that means they're making a lot of human decisions, and therefore they're actually fairly responsible for what's going on.
It's probably, yeah, all those things. And the argument they always use is it's sort of trade secrets. So, you know, but you know, when we have this thorny discussion around regulating social media, regulating content is a fool's errand. You know,
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Like that's the thing is like I don't really care that fact checking left.
Well, no. The fact checking is fine, but it's just like that's not like where the battle is. It's about amplification. No, actually, the theory behind Facebook's fact checking thing was the right one. It wasn't about like it was about like fact checkers come in and say this is blatant false campaign. Make sure you down and then they downrank it. But that process should have been completely transparent as well. You know, we've got to understand how that's happening. But that's no, that is that is civil society having some sort of say over the algorithm, which is probably what we need to head towards. But we don't really know whether it worked. It was still done in the dark. The fact checkers always felt used. They never felt that anything they had no idea what they were doing, whether it actually fed into anything. So it always felt like a PR thing, you know?
I don't know. I guess I just think it's so epistemologically naive that it's just like it blows the mind that we were doing this.
I think no. Why? It's how it's. There's nothing that right or wrong in the process. But it's not. It's not really about facts versus non-facts. I mean, that's only a tiny bit of the issue. It's about worldviews, identities, narratives, whatever. A lot of these things are not in the truth, not truth space. Yeah. Firstly, and secondly, the way it works, we never really understood.
I guess is the penultimate claim you just made was like it's been about these worldviews, these perspectives, and that just gets really tricky really quickly because you understand facts within a narrative. You have to understand narratives within a context of evaluation on it. And it's so hard not to then just do something like the right-wingers are accusing them of doing, is censoring narratives, censoring worldviews on that. It gets there very quickly. And it's really, really hard not to do so. And you'd have to come up with a really bizarrely complicated kind of cross-checking on it to make sure your fact checkers had, kind of a well-balanced form of narratives, and then who gets to decide on all of that. It just gets ridiculously complicated to do well on it.
No, well, I mean, look, no, there were exactly. I actually think it's perfectly fine to have this debate. It just has to be done openly. No, there were attempts to do that. So the way you structure it's about prioritization. Why fact check? I don't know. Why are you choosing to fact check Jeremy Corbyn or Ben Shapiro kind of thing when both of them are talking nonsense? Jeremy Corbyn more. But so Full Fact, one of the main organizations that work with Facebook, they actually did try to structure it. This is where this whole concept of harms comes in. So you start with what is the risk of this untruth to people's lives. So if it's a medical thing, like, there's something about drinking mercury to cure COVID, that comes top. So you do it by harms. And once you get into political harms, you're actually in a space, you'd go for something that attacks like something that could damage an election. So fake stories about election irregularity would be top. Once you're into opinions, that's probably, you're never going to go there. I mean, that's the last thing you would ever do, and only because defining the harms of that is very hard. No. People built up ways of thinking about this which are not crazy, but it's and some of the things probably is important. It's probably important for them to sort of prioritize, facts that could end up with people, I don't know, eating Persil pellets because they think they'll wash out their gut or something. Probably that should come top.
Okay, we're gonna keep having this discussion. I think the harms, like rating the harms, is really like the point here on it, and that should have been made, I think, clearer to people on it, or classifying them.
But I don't know if that was how they classified it. I just know that was sort of like how people theorized it, because I don't think we know. I mean, maybe they did. I never was involved in the Facebook backing thing.
Well, maybe we should have one of them on. Let's have a Facebook fact checker on and ask them.
Full facts are very good. Full facts are very good.
But, okay. Last question. I know you've thought a lot about this. I know you've done a lot of work on it. And I've been thinking about this as well. How can we explain the complexity of this world, particularly the geopolitics, to ordinary Americans? I say this like from someone who actually hasn't tried very much in a lot of ways. Filter Labs, like we don't like our platform and our data feeds aren't really just for like everyday Americans. We're normally targeting pretty sophisticated users within governments and even now financial um, companies and hedge funds and things like that. Um, but I guess increasingly like what I'm seeing is like, oh, I wish my mom, I wish my, like someone, a friend, an uncle or someone would be able to see this complexity a little bit more, or maybe it's not as complex and we're just like hold the like, but it just runs against the narrative they've taken. How do you think we should go about explaining the world to ordinary Americans, assuming you don't think we're doing it very well at the moment?
People feel, so I spent the last 2 years looking at this. And among other, I mean, I was doing other things as well, but this has been a sort of 2 years worth of staring at research around this. Polling, in-depth interviews with representative samples of the American people, looking at how various messages work. People are facing a sense of total chaos. They really don't understand America's role in the world. They don't understand why these alliances exist. They don't understand why these international institutions exist. They have a very chaotic sense of who's a friend and who's an enemy. And in that kind of chaos, the people who are telling a coherent story are you call them isolationists if you want. The people who are saying, well, let the world burn. We're just going to turn inwards. And that's, I think, and you mentioned transactionalism. Transactionalism then becomes a way of replacing meaning. If we can't understand what's going on, then let's just do deals. Deals are kind of like how you make sense of things when you've given up on making sense of things. And obviously that goes into a very deep emotional space. This is not about understanding purely. It's about emotions and the sense that stuff is being taken away from us and we need to punish those who are taking stuff away. And the most worrying thing I see in the data is that a lot of people, especially Trump voters, feel that the people doing the biggest harm are actually the allies. The main evil that's being done to us is the parasitic Europeans, the every cliche you want to mention about Jews in Israel, and the dodgy Ukrainians are stealing everything from us. It can also turn on a total dime. Just to explain to you how these things are nebulous, floating, and up for grabs. And in the next moment, Israel's the best thing. We should defend it. Ukraine are heroes, and I love them. And the Brits, man, I fucking love it when us and the Brits get together, and they're our little butler to our heroism. So just so you understand, these things are so in flux, yeah, and so unstable. Overall, people get that Russia, China wish us ill. They're very bad at articulating. No one's explained to them how. China used to be stealing jobs. It's not. That's kind of that's kind of gone. It's like Mexico steals our jobs or Canada steals our jobs. It's not really China steals our jobs anymore. There's just a sense of malign intent. In that sense, people are much wiser than a lot of the Beltway. As in, they look at Xi Jinping, they look at Putin, they're like, oh no, they're bad. Like, actually, in that sense, people are much better than think tankers. Like, they get malign intent on a visceral level. But they don't understand how they're going to be harmed. They kind of get it's about control. When you start talking about that, they kind of get it, that they're going to do things by controlling supply chains. Nobody ever uses the word supply chains, but what we would call supply chains, by controlling grain, by controlling oil, food, stuff. And that means they'll be able to dictate to us. That's kind of the drama. It does come back to control. It does come back to a sense of freedom. The metaphors that people use is that Russia and China are going to control things and they're going to send us up to bed like bad little boys. And they're going to tell us what to do. So it's there. Nebulously, it's there. but there's no sense of what we do to stop it, what winning is, who are our stories and our heroes to do it, who are our friends. All that has to be narrated, basically.
Yeah, I mean, that strikes me as right, is that they have an intuition that is probably accurate about the power relation there, about how that is. But I think there's been an obfuscation around what success looks like. What does, winning look like in these ways? And I don't think we know anymore. And I don't think this is actually the Trump campaign, the Trump White House's fault. I think that's actually something that is like more indicative of our society writ large. It's like we don't know what a good outcome is anymore. Like for us, like we don't really like have a vision for the good, you might say, for it anymore. And we're just kind of like working, and that's like I think all you have left then is transaction, which is kind of like depressing, I guess. But maybe maybe that's the last word.
Well, maybe we need to start unpacking what transaction means. Like we pile a kind of, when we say that, we mean something very deeply cynical, but actually it doesn't have to be. You can start talking about how you need to have transactions with people you can trust, or else the transaction doesn't work. And there's maybe sort of we always use that term kind of like in sort of a cold realism, nasty gangsters doing deals kind of way, but actually that's the basis of trust and mutual dependence and understanding where we need each other and how my freedom helps to guarantee your freedom. So maybe we should start thinking of positive, sort of like flourishing transactionalism and gangster transactionalism.
I'm gonna stick with my like softly anti-transactional because I don't want all of my life to be like reduced to just transactions there. But all right, I think we've run out of time here. Thank you very much. This has been a lot of fun to go through these, and we'll do it again
In 4 years' time.
in 4 years' time. Yeah. Yeah. So please send us your questions. We'd love to address them and talk about them. So, all right. Well, thanks, Peter.